Chapter 5 Last Chance. A month had gone by where Peter's father hadn't hosted a gathering at all. Peter was relieved and hoped that his father might abort the tradition. This was not the case. The reality was that the king was having trouble finding more eligible girls, so he took a break to seek out noble families with girls of the right age in them. Peter took advantage of this time by spending as much free time as he could with James. James was getting his work done quickly to spend time with Peter. His superiors suspected something was happening with James, but knew better than to intrude, so left him to it. So long as his work was getting done, he was happy. It was James's 17th birthday. Peter hadn't been able to spend time with James on his previous birthday due to his father hosting a third garden party and practically holding his hand round the whole event, forcing him to speak to makeup-covered girls. Peter rushed out to James, who he'd spotted waiting in the garden from his window. Peter gave him a huge hug. James hugged him back and gave him a kiss. "Can I take you somewhere?" James asked Peter, holding his hands. "Of course," Peter replied. James walked through the palace garden with Peter following behind, not holding hands in case they were seen. They arrived at a tall oak tree on the outskirts of the palace gardens. James began climbing up the branches into the tree. "Be careful," Peter told him. "I've done this hundreds of times. You should be careful," James called back to him. "Oh, you want me to come up too?" Peter said and began to climb. "Obviously," James replied. Peter reached James and sat on the branch next to him, holding onto the trunk for support. They looked out at the view. "Wow," Peter breathed. "This is beautiful. Isn't it? I love coming up here to relax. It makes me feel calm. I wanted to share this with you." James looked at Peter, and Peter looked back at James. "Thank you," Peter said. He leaned in to kiss James. They kissed long, and almost fell off the branch. "Whoa!" Peter said, grabbing hold of James so he wouldn't fall. "Maybe it's best not to kiss up here," James said, laughing. "Probably best. Let's leave the kissing until we're back on the ground," Peter replied. When they were back on the ground, Peter held out a small brown box with a blue ribbon on it. "You got me something?" James asked. "You don't have to. It makes me feel sad that I can't get you anything." "Nonsense," Peter said. "You already give me everything I could ever want." James smiled. "Open it," Peter said, getting excited. James pulled the blue ribbon off and opened up the little box. There were marzipan fruits inside. "What are these?" James asked. "Marzipan fruits. I told you about them before." "Oh yes, these are your favourites," James remembered. Peter nodded. James ate one and his face lit up. "Oh wow, these are delicious," he said, and ate another. "I'll save the rest for later." Peter giggled. They walked back to the small garden together. "Oh look, the rosebush has blossomed again," Peter pointed out. "Still just the one rose," James sighed. "What a strange bush." "Like I said, I know which rose is for me," Peter laughed. Peter looked over the top of the wall. The sky was turning pink. "Oh my, is it dusk already?" "Is it?" James said, turning to look. "I must go back inside. My parents will be expecting me at supper," Peter told James. He gave him a kiss and rushed back inside, apologising to James as he disappeared through the door. James smiled. He had enjoyed his birthday. It was getting close to Peter's birthday, and every day made him more and more nervous about his father springing the news on him that time was up for choosing a girl. Peter had to go on a royal visit with his mother and father to a banquet hosted by a neighbouring kingdom. He had told James that he would be away for a few days. James wanted to talk to him about something that had been on his mind. Peter met him under the willow tree, the day before he would set off with his parents. "I have to talk to you," James said. Peter's heart jumped to his mouth and he stopped walking. No, it's not bad. I just have to tell you something that's on my mind," James assured him, holding out his hands. Peter sighed in relief and walked over to hold his hands. James looked deep into Peter's eyes. Peter could see James was sad about something, but waited for him to speak. "I know that soon you'll have to choose someone to marry, and I know that you'll be seeing a lot of girls before then, even though you've met many already. I just wanted to tell you that if you kiss any of them, then that's fine. I won't be upset, and I'll do my best to not be jealous," he said. Peter thought for a moment. I wish this wasn't a conversation we were having," he said. If it were my choice, I'd marry you." He touched his forehead to James's. "What happens once I get married? What happens to us then?" Peter asked with a quiver in his voice. "I don't know. We'll have to cross that bridge when we get to it," James replied. "One step at a time," Peter spoke. "We need to just care about the here and now." "Exactly," James responded. Peter put his hand on the back of James's head. He could feel the soft curls of his hair on his fingers. They kissed. It was soft but passionate. They both felt it was the most intense kiss since the first time they ever kissed. It was a shared moment of bittersweet emotion, and one neither of them would forget. Peter did somewhat enjoy his visit to the neighbouring kingdom. This was only because he was able to keep away from his father for the most part. The banquet hall was even larger than theirs. The one back at their palace seated 100 people, but this palace's banquet hall seated 300. Peter wasn't sat with his father or his mother. He was seated with a number of other princes. If his father had wanted him to find a prince to marry, Peter would have been torn for which one to pick. They were all very handsome. He spotted the princesses and ladies further up the banquet hall, but again, they didn't pique his interest. He spoke with the princes and knights he'd been seated with during the banquet, and felt tired by the end of it. The banquet ended, and Peter was about ready to go to bed, when his father's hand gripped his arm and pulled him to the side. Peter was now standing face to face with a lady who looked a similar age to him. "Lady Helena, this is my son, Prince Peter of Weatherborough," King Harold said to the lady. Peter barely managed to process the situation before the lady had curtsied. "How do you do?" she said. Her voice was strange to Peter. It sounded like she was trying to sound posh. "Very well, thank you," he replied, being polite. "My son is looking for an eligible woman to marry if—" King Harold got cut off by the lady. "I would love to," she said. Prince Peter flinched. "Well," King Harold wasn't sure what to say. "It's really up to Peter," he said. This was the only time Peter had seen his father not jump at an opportunity to wed him. "You'll take me, won't you, Peter?" she asked, leaning in very close to his face. She was so close, he could see his own reflection in her eyes. He leaned back. I wasn't planning on—" He felt his father's hands on his shoulders. He was worried his father was going to push him into her, but to his surprise, his father pulled him backwards. "Well, we shall go ahead and think about that, Lady Helena," King Harold said, and swiftly walked away, taking Peter with him. "What was that all about?" Peter asked his father. "You didn't seem to care that I didn't want to marry that one," Peter said. "I was asked by her father to introduce you. He's been trying to marry her off, but everyone turns her down because they think she's crazy," King Harold said. "Well, maybe he should get her some help," Peter suggested. "It's none of my business," King Harold said. "I thought she might be all right, but she was a little scary." Peter agreed. "We'd better get some rest. Keep an eye out for any girls tomorrow, however." Peter rolled his eyes. "But maybe stay away from that one," he said, referring to Lady Helena. Peter saw many girls the next day. His father got mad again when Peter told him none of them interested him. The father he'd seen last night may have well had been a dream, as he seemed eager as ever to pressure Peter to find a wife. Peter left the garden party feeling stressed and was ready to go home. The entire carriage ride back to the palace felt tense. King Harold was glaring at Peter most of the time, and Peter pretended not to notice as he looked out of the window. Queen Lillian sat quietly as usual, also looking out of the window. It was Prince Peter's 17th birthday way too fast. Peter woke up feeling nervous. He got dressed as quietly as he could, as if being quiet might make a difference to the fact he was now 17. His bedroom door opened, making him jump, and King Harold strolled in. "Father," he said, "why don't you knock? I could have been naked." "I'm your father," he said, as if that changed the issue. Peter frowned at the comment. "Now, son," King Harold began. Peter tensed, knowing what was coming. "In 1 year you must be married, so you have only 2 opportunities to pick a wife before I choose someone for you. Understand this, son," the king said. "I know," Peter replied. "There will be 1 more ball. If you don't find anyone there, then we will go to my last resort, and if not then, I will choose someone for you, and you will have to marry her." "I understand," Peter said. "You had better. I don't want to choose someone for you, but I will if I have to. I don't know why you haven't liked any of the ladies so far, But maybe you need to lower your expectations, son, or you may end up with someone you don't like. King Harold was standing very close to Prince Peter, looking down at him. Peter nodded. King Harold left the room. Peter was shaking from the interaction with his father. He sat down on a chair and cried silently from stress. Peter went to the blue room and found Queen Lillian in there. "Peter," she said happily, and got up to give him a hug. "Happy birthday, dear," she said, and they sat down opposite each other. "What are you doing in here?" Peter asked. "Oh, I had some time, so I came to play Pyramid," she told him. "I see." He sat back and sighed. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "No," he replied. She looked at him for an explanation. "Father came to talk to me again about finding someone to be my wife," he told her. "I don't care. I don't even want to get married," he continued. "I just want to get on with my life without being pestered every day to be looking for a girl." Queen Lillian nodded. "I'm afraid there's nothing that can be done about it." "I know. I wish I were king, only so I could get rid of this stupid rule." "Well, you'll be king one day," she tried to assure him. "Not quickly enough," he said, and got up to leave. "I have a birthday gift for you," she said, before he could leave. She leaned down to pick up a box and handed it to him. He opened it, and it was 4 French macarons. "Thank you," he said, and gave her a little hug. He left, eating one of them. A couple of months later, like King Harold had said, there was a large ball held. Many women came from far away to try and win over the prince. Prince Peter was out in the small garden with James as people were arriving. They had hidden under an arch in the wall, so nobody would spot them. "I'd rather be looking for another prince if I'm honest," Prince Peter told James. "Ah, then I would be jealous," James said, half joking. "Do you think that you will choose someone, or will you settle with who your father picks?" James asked. "I'd rather choose somebody myself, but I don't ever like anybody. I might just have to settle for my father's choice. At least then it'll be set." Peter rubbed his temples. James put his hand on Peter's arm, then leaned in to kiss him on the cheek. Peter touched James's face. "If only you were one of the people I had to choose," he said to James, and kissed him. Peter stood next to his father, watching pale, makeup-covered girls come down the ballroom stairs, one after another. Peter wished that one of them would stand out to him, willing one of them to catch his eye, but none of them did. He thought they all looked the same as before. They could have been all the same girls as the last 10 balls and he wouldn't know. Peter danced with many of them, and all of them seemed as dull or desperate as the next. He was polite and friendly to all of them, but he didn't particularly like any of them. He thought his father was going to explode with rage when he had to admit once again that he didn't like any of them. He swore his father would have slapped him if guests hadn't still been lingering. Peter went to bed feeling worse than before. He curled up in a ball in bed and thought about James. That was the only thing that made him feel calm enough to fall asleep. It was King Harold's final attempt at letting his son choose his own bride. He had invited 5 ladies from distant kingdoms to come and spend time at the palace and try to impress the prince. Only 4 of them were able to come, as the 5th lady had fallen ill. Prince Peter greeted each of them as they arrived: Lady Vivian, Lady Jasmine, Lady Petunia, and Lady Delilah. Prince Peter, King Harold, and Queen Lillian had supper with the girls. It was less agonising than the previous dinner Peter had been forced into. Prince Peter saw that the girls looked like dolls again, and they all acted stuck-up, which he didn't like. It was the second day of the girls' visit to the palace, and the girls had decided to walk through the palace gardens together. James was in the garden as they passed by. Something caught his attention. He tripped up, he was in such a hurry to get to them. "Lady Vivian! Lady Vivian!" he called. All the girls turned to him, horrified a servant was speaking to them. "How dare you speak to me?" Lady Vivian said. "No, but," he tried to explain. "You only speak when spoken to," she yelled back at him. He tried to speak again, when one of the other ladies shrieked, "Vivian, your hair! Spider!" Lady Jasmine screamed. The other ladies screamed at seeing the large spider on Vivian's hair. She jumped up and down in fear. "Oh, hold still! I'll get it!" James told her. She did as he said. He picked it up in his hands and threw it on the ground, where it scuttled away. Lady Vivian turned even paler than her makeup and began to sway. James caught her as she fell, and the three other ladies grabbed hold of her and slowly lowered her to the ground. At that moment, King Harold and Prince Peter turned the corner on the path to see 4 ladies and James in a huddle on the floor. Peter ran over to see what was going on. "What happened?" he asked, seeing Lady Vivian coming to, with the 3 ladies fanning her, and James holding her hands for support. Peter crouched down next to James, in front of Lady Vivian. James spoke. "There was a spider on her. I got it off, but she passed out." The ladies nodded. The king finally arrived by everybody. Peter took hold of Vivian's hands with one hand, and James let go. Peter put his other hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked her. She looked confused, but nodded her head. He thanked James and put his arm around Vivian to lift her up onto her feet. The other ladies helped keep her upright. King Harold glared at James, and he hurried back to his work. The king followed Peter and the girls back up to the palace. Unfortunately, this incident had not been enough to encourage Peter to want any of the girls. He and Harold had an intense conversation. "I have given you every opportunity to pick a girl to wed. You have turned down every single one. I didn't expect to be in this situation, you know." King Harold paced the throne room. "Well, I didn't like any of them, so just pick somebody and it'll be over with," Peter replied. "Fine. You clearly don't care about your own life. This is your fault. You cannot blame me if it backfires on you," King Harold told him. "I know, I'm not blaming anybody," Peter said. "Why, Peter? Why don't you want to marry them?" King Harold said, more disappointed than angry. "Because I'm not in love with them," Peter shot back. "Like you know anything about love," King Harold said. "I bet I know more than you," Peter replied without thinking. "What is that supposed to mean?" the king asked angrily. "Nothing," Peter sighed. "Just forget it." The king walked close to Peter. 3 months from now, your bride-to-be will arrive. She will spend 2 months here getting acquainted with you and the palace, and you will be married 1 month before your 18th birthday," King Harold told the prince. Peter nodded. Over the next 3 months, Peter spent many hours with James. They sat together, sharing stories and kisses, hoping to make the most of every moment together. The single rose had bloomed again when it was suddenly 2 days until Peter's bride-to-be would arrive. Peter walked to where he and James had decided to meet. It was a large wall on the outskirts of the palace gardens, where people rarely went. Peter saw James leaning against it and joined him. "In 2 days, when is she arriving?" James "I must spend tomorrow after a few moments of silence, whatever that means." He rested his head against the wall and closed his eyes. "What does this mean for us?" James asked. "What do we do?" Peter kept his eyes closed. "I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose you," he said. "Then don't," James said. Peter heard his voice crack. He opened his eyes. James was looking right at him, and his eyes were misty. "Don't leave me," James said, and burst into tears. He gripped Peter in a tight hug. Peter held him tight. I won't," he assured him. "Don't worry, I'm not leaving you." He stroked James's head. James sniffled. "I didn't want to be like this. I didn't want to be upset and selfish," James said, his voice slightly muffled in Peter's chest. No, I'd be exactly the same. I'd have been doing this months ago if it were the other way round," Peter told him. "I'm sorry," James said. "There is absolutely no need to apologise," Peter said, pushing James up so he could look into his eyes. "You have absolutely nothing to be sorry for," Peter told him, and kissed him. The two of them spent the afternoon together. They enjoyed each other's company as much as they could. There was a lot of kissing and tearing up. Peter got up to leave for supper. "I wish this wasn't how things had to be," James said, getting up. "I know, I wish that too." Peter took his hands. "But I'm not going to leave you. I promise. I love you." He kissed James. James took Peter's head in his hands so as not to break the kiss. Eventually they pulled away. "I love you too, Peter," James said. It was the day before Peter's bride-to-be would arrive. Peter was taking a bath that had been drawn for him in the room next to his. He leaned his head back, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked up at the light blue ceiling, condensation dampening on the paint and dripping down the tiled walls. He saw air bubbles covering his body in the clear water. He wanted the water to carry him away to a faraway land, where he didn't have to marry anyone, where he could be himself and not be ruled over by anybody. His golden hair fell over his eyes. "I have to be strong," he said to himself, "but I will not change for anyone. I will be myself," he promised himself.